The bitter wind howled through the canyons of southern Colorado, sweeping over the coal fields where thousands of men toiled beneath the earth. In the small mining towns scattered across the region, soot-streaked faces bore the marks of endless labor, their lungs filled with the dust of a world that cared little for their suffering. To the men working deep underground, the mines were both a prison and a battlefield. There were no guarantees of survival, only the grim certainty that one day the earth might decide to swallow them whole. Cave-ins, gas explosions, and the ever-present threat of suffocation were as common as the low wages they received. Yet, they had no choice. For many, this was the only way to keep their families from starving. Among these men was Angelo Marcotti, an Italian immigrant who had arrived in America with nothing but the strength in his hands. He worked 12-hour shifts, hammering away at the coal seams, each swing of his pickaxe sending tiny black particles into the air. His wife, Maria, and their two children, Luca and Sofia, lived in a cramped company-owned shack, barely large enough to keep out the winter's bite. Each day, Angelo saw his friends disappear, some buried alive in the tunnels, others simply fired and cast out into the cold when their bodies grew too broken to work. There were no second chances here. The Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, owned by one of the richest families in America, made sure of that. The Rockefellers, sitting in their grand mansions far away from the coal-dusted streets of Ludlow, did not care about the men who made their fortunes possible. The rules of the game were clear. If you worked, you ate. If you stopped, you starved. But beneath the surface, the fire of rebellion had begun to smolder. The miners were growing restless. Whispers of change floated through the darkness of the tunnels. Men gathered in secret after long shifts, their voices low but their anger rising. "The company treats us like animals," one of them muttered, his hands clenched into fists. "Then maybe it's time we stopped acting like them," another replied. Angelo sat in silence, staring into the flickering candlelight. He had come to America dreaming of a better life. Instead, he had found a nightmare. Something was coming. A storm. A reckoning. And when it arrived, it would shake the earth itself. The sun had long set over Ludlow, leaving the mining camp in darkness except for the dim glow of oil lamps scattered between the shacks. The bitter night air carried the scent of coal dust and unspoken frustration. Inside one of the larger tents near the edge of the camp, a gathering of men huddled close, their voices low but their words burning with purpose. Angelo Marcotti sat among them, his fingers curled into his palms. He was exhausted from another 12-hour shift, his muscles screaming for rest, but something heavier sat on his chest, something far more urgent than fatigue. At the center of the group stood Louis Lou McIntyre, a man with sharp eyes and a voice that carried even in a whisper. He had been in the mines longer than most, surviving cave-ins and gas leaks, watching too many men buried alive for the sake of another day's wages. "We can't keep living like this," Lou said, his jaw tight with fury. "They pay us scraps, force us to buy from their stores at prices they control, and if we break our backs for them, they toss us aside like coal dust." The men murmured in agreement. They had all seen it, how the company owned everything, the homes, the stores, the very lives of the workers. A younger miner, Jim Holloway, barely in his 20s, spat onto the dirt floor. "You think they care? The Rockefellers don't even know our names. We could die tomorrow, and they'd just hire someone else to take our places." The room fell silent. They all knew it was true. Then a voice broke through the tension. Mary Donovan, a woman who had lost her husband to the mines, stepped forward. Her face, lined with sorrow, held no fear. "My husband died for them, and they didn't even send a letter. My boy will grow up without a father because of those greedy bastards. If we don't stand up now, they'll keep taking everything from us until there's nothing left." A sharp knock at the tent entrance made the group tense. The miners exchanged wary glances. Company guards had been known to spy on them, to break up meetings before they could gain momentum. Lou held up a hand, signaling for calm, before opening the flap just enough to peer outside. A familiar face stared back. Charles Chuck Pritchard, an organizer from the United Mine Workers of America, UMWA. He slipped inside quickly, brushing the cold from his coat. "They're watching," he said in a hushed tone. "The company knows something's stirring. They've been hiring more guards, arming them." The weight in the room grew heavier. Chuck looked at each man and woman, his voice steady. "But they're scared. That's why they're doing it. They know we have the numbers. They know if we strike, they'll feel it. It's time to make a choice. The choice had already been made in their hearts. Angelo glanced at Maria, who stood near the entrance, holding little Sophia in her arms. Her eyes met his, filled with both fear and resolve. Then, Lou McIntyre spoke the words that would change everything. We strike. A ripple of agreement swept through the room, and in that moment, the fire beneath the earth had found its way to the surface. The war had begun. The bitter cold of February clung to the miners of Ludlow like a second skin. Snow blanketed the ground, but it did little to muffle the tension in the air. The strike had lasted 5 months now. 5 months without wages. 5 months of hunger gnawing at the stomachs of men, women, and children. 5 months of waiting for the company to break, but it wasn't the company that was breaking. It was them. Angelo Marcotti sat beside the fire in the center of the tent colony, holding his son, Luca, close to his chest. The boy had stopped complaining about the cold weeks ago. That's what scared Angelo most. Nearby, Lou McIntyre and the other union leaders gathered, voices low, eyes scanning the horizon. The company guards had grown bolder. They beat one of our men half to death last night, Lou muttered, his breath curling into the frozen air. Jim Holloway, found him in the snow this morning, left for dead. Angelo's fists clenched. Jim had been barely more than a boy, no older than 20. He had joined the strike believing in a better future. Now he lay in a nearby tent, broken and unconscious. This is what they do, Chuck Pritchard said. They make us suffer, hoping we'll crawl back to the mines just to survive. We won't, Mary Donovan's voice cut through the night. We're too far in now. She was right. The miners had burned every bridge back to the company. The only path left was forward. March 10th, 1914. The first casualty of the war came in the dead of night. A miner was shot outside the camp, a single bullet tearing through his chest. His wife found him in the morning, his frozen body lying in the snow just beyond the fence. The company guards claimed he was armed, that he had tried to attack them, but everyone in the colony knew the truth. It was an execution, and it was a message. This is what happens when you refuse to kneel. The miners buried their friend that evening, anger simmering beneath their grief. Children cried beside the grave as their mothers whispered prayers. And that night, for the first time since the strike began, the miners struck back. A group of men, silent as shadows, slipped from the tent colony, moving toward the mining outpost just beyond the hills. Armed with stolen rifles, they ambushed the company guards, sending them scattering into the night. No one died, but the message was clear. The miners wouldn't be victims anymore. The breaking point had come. The fight for survival had become a war. Snowfall dusted the rooftops of Ludlow's makeshift tent colony, softening the hard edges of suffering. But beneath the gentle white, hunger gnawed at the bellies of the striking miners and their families. It had been months since they had walked off the job, demanding fair wages, safer conditions, and the dignity of choosing where to live and shop. And for months, the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, backed by its powerful owner, John D. Rockefeller Jr., had refused to yield. Instead, they fought back the only way the rich knew how, with force. January 1914, Angelo Marcotti stood at the edge of the camp, arms crossed against the cold, watching a train roll through the valley. It wasn't just carrying passengers. It was filled with company guards, private detectives, and strikebreakers. Men brought in to do the work they had refused to do. And worse, there were rumors, whispers spreading through the colony like an illness. The National Guard is coming, Lou McIntyre muttered beside him. His eyes, once filled with fire, now carried exhaustion. Governor Ammons called them in. The news sent a bitter chill through Angelo's spine. The Colorado National Guard was supposed to protect the people, but in this town, everyone knew who really held power. Rockefeller's money had already bought private militias, Baldwin Felts detectives, and now an army. It was no longer just a strike, it was war. February 1914. The first few weeks of the National Guard's arrival had given the miners false hope. Soldiers in crisp uniforms marched into Ludlow, their bayonets glinting under the winter sun. Some of the officers had even spoken to the miners kindly, promising they were here to keep peace, not to take sides. But the lie didn't last. Soon, soldiers began escorting strikebreakers into the mines, harassing union leaders and arresting men without cause. The company store in town, still under Rockefeller's control, refused to sell to strikers. Supplies grew thin, and then came the worst part, the random shootings. At night, miners heard gunshots in the hills. Some claimed to have seen guards firing into the tent colony from a distance. Warning shots meant to remind them who was in control. One evening, as Maria put Luca and Sofia to bed, a single bullet ripped through the canvas of their tent, missing Angelo's head by inches. Sofia woke up screaming. Maria clutched her daughter tight, tears streaming down her face. "This isn't a strike anymore," she whispered. "They want us gone." March 1914. The National Guard had started rounding up strike leaders, forcing them into custody for disturbing the peace. Chuck Pritchard, the union organizer, had been taken away one night and beaten so badly he couldn't walk for days. The message was clear. Rockefeller didn't need to negotiate. He just needed to wait for the miners to starve or surrender, but they wouldn't. Instead, the miners began to fight back. Men dug trenches around the colony, preparing for the worst. They fashioned rifles out of stolen parts, hiding them under blankets and beneath the floorboards of their tents. They sent secret messengers to Denver, pleading for the Union to send reinforcements. Lou stood before the men one evening, his face grim. "They're pushing us to break," he said. "But we don't break." Angelo looked at his wife, at his children. He knew they were running out of time, and deep in his gut, he feared something terrible was coming. Something far worse than hunger, something that would burn everything down. April 19th, 1914, the night was eerily quiet, too quiet. Angelo Marcotti lay awake in his tent, listening to the wind whistle through the camp. His wife, Maria, and their two children, Luca and Sofia, slept beside him, their breathing shallow from exhaustion and hunger. The strike had stretched into its 7th month. Food was scarce, hope even scarcer. But something about this night felt different. The usual sounds, the distant clang of a pickaxe, the soft murmurs of men keeping watch were absent. A tension hung over Ludlow like a storm cloud. Then, just as Angelo began to drift into an uneasy sleep, a gunshot cracked through the air. Then another. Then a storm of gunfire. Screams tore through the night as bullets rained down on the camp. The Colorado National Guard and company-hired gunmen had opened fire from the hills. The attack had begun. Angelo leapt up, shielding Maria and the children as bullets ripped through the canvas. "Get to the pits." Lou McIntyre's voice roared outside. Angelo grabbed Luca and Sofia, dragging them toward the underground pits they had dug beneath their tents for protection. Maria followed, clutching Sofia tightly against her chest. Around them, chaos exploded. Men ran for cover, some returning fire with their old rifles. Others fell where they stood, cut down by the relentless barrage. Women and children screamed, some clutching their loved ones, others scrambling for shelter. Angelo barely made it to the pit before an explosion shook the ground. A tent had been set on fire. The flames roared, casting an orange glow against the dark sky. One by one, the company guards and soldiers began torching the entire colony, their laughter and shouts blending with the cries of the dying. Inside the pit, Angelo clutched his children tightly, his heart hammering. "Stay quiet," he whispered, pressing his hand over Luca's mouth as footsteps approached above them. Maria was shaking, her arms wrapped around Sofia, who was barely breathing from the smoke filling the air. Outside, the sounds of gunfire mixed with the screams of those who couldn't escape. Then, something heavy collapsed over the pit's entrance. They were trapped. The fire grew hotter, the smoke thicker. Angelo knew they didn't have much time. He clawed at the dirt, trying to push away whatever had fallen, but his lungs burned with every breath. Maria coughed violently beside him, struggling to keep Sofia awake. The sounds of battle faded, replaced by the roar of the fire consuming the camp. And then, silence. The world had turned to fire. The acrid stench of smoke and burning flesh choked the air as Angelo Marcotti clawed desperately at the dirt above him. Every breath felt like swallowing embers, and every heartbeat pounded with the desperate knowledge that time was slipping away. His children, Luca and Sofia, huddled against Maria in the darkness of the pit, their tiny bodies trembling. The tent colony was burning above them. The gunfire had stopped, replaced by the crackling roar of flames and the distant shouts of men moving through the wreckage. The massacre was over. The killing was done. But for those trapped beneath the rubble, death was still closing in. With every ounce of strength left in his battered body, Angelo pressed his shoulder against the collapsed debris, pushing until his arms screamed in protest. He could hear Maria's ragged breaths behind him, hear Sofia's whimpering growing weaker. They were running out of air. Then a sliver of light. Angelo shoved harder, ignoring the pain in his ribs. Finally, with a desperate groan, He forced an opening just wide enough to crawl through. The sight above him made his blood run cold. The Ludlow camp, their home, their hope, their fight, was gone. Charred remains of tents smoldered in the early morning light, reduced to blackened skeletons against the sky. The bodies of men, women, and children lay scattered among the wreckage, some clutching one another even in death. The pit next to theirs had collapsed completely, burying those inside alive. Maria crawled out behind him, gasping for air, tears streaming down her soot-covered face. She pulled Luca and Sophia through the opening, holding them tightly as they coughed and cried. They had survived. Barely, but others had not. Not far from where they stood, Lou McIntyre's body lay motionless, his rifle still clutched in his hands. A bullet hole marked the spot between his eyes. Angelo staggered forward, his legs weak, his mind numb. This wasn't a battlefield. It was a graveyard. The National Guard and company thugs were gone, their work finished. They had left the miners to count their dead and bury their grief. Angelo turned toward Maria, his hands shaking. "They killed us," he whispered. "They wanted to erase us." Maria's eyes, once filled with fear, now held something else: rage. They weren't alone. Survivors were beginning to emerge from the wreckage, their faces streaked with soot and tears. Mothers cradled lifeless children. Fathers knelt beside the bodies of their friends, their cries piercing the cold morning air. And then something else happened. A slow, deliberate sound rose above the silence, a single voice, a song. A miner, his face bloodied, his clothes torn, stood in the center of the destruction, singing. It was a Union song, one they had sung in the tunnels, in the meetings, on the picket lines. Then another voice joined, then another, until the air was filled with a defiant chorus, the voices of the broken refusing to be silenced. The Ludlow massacre had been meant to crush them, to erase them, but instead, it had done something else. It had made them unstoppable. Days later, news of the massacre spread across the country. The press called it a slaughter. The public, for the first time, saw the true cost of Rockefeller's greed.